Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 24. And we're going to take a look at the early 2000s. So, the election of 2000 was kind of a controversial election. Our Democratic candidates for president and vice president were Al Gore. And Al Gore had been the former vice president under Bill Clinton, and his running mate was a Connecticut congressman named Joe Lieberman. Lieberman, after the 9/11 attacks, had a fallout with the Democratic Party and actually became an independent for a while. Um, these two candidates were pitted against the Republicans, and George W. Bush was the candidate, and his running mate was Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney actually had um, quite a history in Washington. He had actually served under the Reagan and the Bush administrations when we talk about national security and such. Um, so, needless to say, he had some experience there that maybe some people thought was really good for this office. When we talk about the election, it is controversial and it has everything to do with the state of Florida and how they were going about voting. They actually had a ballot that's called a Chad, and a Chad is kind of a weird kind of ballot because you get a pen that you actually punch your ballot. So like when you want to pick a candidate, you have this little thing that you punch out, and you get a hole there in the ballot, and that ballot would eventually be read. Well, the problem with the ballots in Florida is these holes in the Chads. Some voters didn't clearly punch the hole completely out, and thus when you talk about the ballots, it was really hard to see whether or not they had actually voted clearly. And thus, there were questions about whether or not they actually did cast a vote for Bush or Gore. Matter of fact, on election night, the newscasters were kind of going back and forth to the point where they basically couldn't call it the election because of this situation. So the state of Florida decided that they were going to do a hand count, and that was controversial because some people thought that that was unfair to the Republicans. And thus, a court case went before the Supreme Court very rapidly, the case of Bush versus Gore. And the Supreme Court ruled that the manual recount of the ballots in Florida was unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause that's within the 14th Amendment, because not all voters were treated the same. So, as a result, who was certified as the winner of the election? That was George W. Bush. And he had won by basically 537 electoral votes. And so, needless to say, it was kind of a very close election, I should say, not electoral votes, but popular votes in the state. Certainly one of the closest elections that I can think of in my memory. So we're going to skip the item above and go right to letter D. One of the things that President Bush did when he got into office was to set about reforming education with a plan called No Child Left Behind. This plan called for standardized testing to see whether or not students were actually meeting the academic goals that were set before them, and to see whether or not they could actually perform kind of on a certain at a certain standard throughout the United States. What the tests would do would be to inform parents whether or not their schools were doing a good job, and thus, if a parent was sending a kid to a public school and the schools tested poorly, parents might have an opportunity to receive some financial assistance to send their kids to private schools. Granted, there were a lot of people that were upset by this, especially when you talk about the world of public education, because of the fact that they possibly could lose some of their funding. So, needless to say, a lot of people hated this. Another program that was introduced by Bush was the Strategic Defense Program, which is actually kind of a chip off the old block of the Strategic Defense Initiative under Ronald Reagan, or AKA Star Wars. This program was to develop missiles and other devices to shoot down nuclear missiles up in outer space. Unfortunately, it was a little ahead of its time, just like the Strategic Defense Initiative. All right, we're going to look at section two. What did the hijackers do on 9/11? And basically, they did this. They crashed a couple planes into the World Trade Center in New York. They also crashed a plane into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And a fourth plane was brought down in a field in Pennsylvania by the passengers. Many believe that that plane was probably en route to maybe strike the White House or the Capitol building. So, needless to say, those passengers were really courageous to do what they did. How did many Americans respond to these attacks? When we talk about medical workers and firefighters, many of them throughout the United States went to New York to help out. Blood donations through the American Red Cross skyrocketed. People were donating things like food, supplies, and money. In a way, it was a uh, very uniting period of time in American history. What was terrorism? Terrorism, by definition, is basically violence used by a non governmental group against civilians to achieve a political goal. And when we look at what was happening with 9/11 and even events that happened prior to that, terrorism, for the most part, was certainly running rampant in certain parts of the world, particularly the Middle East. So, what role did America's need for oil play in Middle Eastern terrorism? Middle Easterners resented the foreign companies that were taking their oil, and the fact that they were taking the resource out and not necessarily putting money back in to help the peoples of their countries in the Middle East. This also led to kind of a growth in fundamental Islamic values that typically are at odds with the Western world. And this kind of starts back even in the time of the 1970s when we talk about the Iranian Revolution that took place in the late 1970s. What do fundamentalist militant Muslims seek? Well, they would like to see the overthrow of pro Western governments in the Middle East and also to establish what is known as a pure Islamic state. Today, we'd probably just call this ISIS. When you look at the map below there, any kind of nation that's in the red, these are nations that are predominantly religiously wise Muslim. And what's happening in places like Iran and even today parts of Afghanistan and Iraq is that you're seeing people wanting to build a country that is predominantly just run by the clerics, the Muslim clerics. So, why was Al Qaeda originally formed, and and how did that purpose eventually change? It was formed to support Afghan resistance to the Soviet Union back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when the Soviets invaded. When we think about it today, it's more of a terrorist group trying to get maybe its ideas of having an Islamic state somewhere in the Middle East. Number eight, what was one way that President Bush planned to fight terroristic groups and aid aside from military force, he did order the freeze of financial assets in order to cut off their funding. He also asked Congress to pass laws making it easier to track terrorists. And some of this resulted in what is known as the USA Patriot Act. The Patriot Act has actually kind of been allowed um, to basically, die out. But for about 10 years, it allowed for the government to do wiretapping, to look at mail, to look at um, internet usage, to look at cell phone usage, to track those people who might be involved in terrorist activities. What agency was created to protect the country from further terroristic attacks? And that would be the Office of Homeland Security, which is now a cabinet position within the executive branch. What type of bioterrorism did Americans face in October of 2001? Shortly after the 9/11 attacks, there was an anthrax scare that was happening in the US, and some of it was probably playing off this fear that we had. A lot of this was kind of homegrown. And anthrax, for the most part, is a deadly bacteria. In the case of what was happening in 2001, this bacteria was placed in things like letters and mailed to, some of the news networks and some government officials, and there were some people that obviously got very ill by handling these letters. Needless to say, this puts the whole nation, at a state of alarm because of the fact that it's just very chaotic. Shortly thereafter, the government started going after Afghanistan. And what targets in Afghanistan did the U.S. begin bombing in October of 2001? A lot of these were Al Qaeda camps that were used to train some of our terrorists. And then also Taliban military forces. The Taliban had been running the country of Afghanistan for a number of years and had been pretty harsh to its people. And needless to say, these were the areas that were the number one targets of our government. Moving on to our next section, talking about the war on terror. After the September 11th attacks, the U.S. went to war in Afghanistan to bring down the Taliban regime. Unfortunately, in the last year, we have seen the rise of the Taliban again. The United States worked with the Northern Alliance, which was a coalition of Afghan groups that had been fighting the Taliban for many years. Many of these members of the Northern Alliance provided intelligence to help us start tracking down terrorists. But the number one terrorist that we were trying to track down was Osama bin Laden. And it was believed that he crossed into Waziristan, which was a mountainous region of Pakistan. And he may have done that, but when it comes time to finding Osama bin Laden, he was in Pakistan, of all places. So, Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction would include things like nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, and these happen to be the concern of President Bush and his advisors. The United States had relied on a policy of deterrence for many years, which said that if any nation used weapons of mass destruction, the United States would do a counterattack. And certainly that was kind of our position going into this. Uh, in Iraq, Saddam Hussein had actually used nerve gas against his own citizens, and he killed a number of Kurdish Iraqis shortly after the first Persian Gulf War. And the United States believed that he possessed these weapons and he needed to be dealt with before something bad happened. So Bush goes on TV and he declares the nations of Iraq and Iran and North Korea the axis of evil. And the reason why I did this is because they posed a great threat to not only the United States but people worldwide. The United States wanted Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein to um, readmit United Nations weapon inspectors to look for these weapons, to stop supporting terrorism, and to stop oppressing his own people. None of which he was really interested in doing, but when we talk about the weapons, we never were able to find weapons of mass destruction. And certainly that has been kind of an issue even yet in this day and age about why we were in the Middle East. In 2003, the United States began pressing the United Nations to authorize the use of force against Iraq. The UN was kind of slow to do that, and eventually the United States and Great Britain kind of went on our own, and we went ahead and engaged in a war in Iraq. The Iraqi army shortly after we started attacking, they dissolved as soldiers refused to risk their lives for Saddam Hussein. But the fighting continued long after Bush had declared an end to the major combat operations. The United States found itself trying to suppress an insurgency in Iraq to prevent a civil war and establish new Iraqi governments. Uh, the failure to find any weapons of mass destruction added to this controversy and led a lot of people to think that this war was a mistake. Moving on, looking at number 4 here, where were captured members of Al Qaeda held and why was this controversial? Many of them were taken to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Guantanamo was a little piece of Cuba that the United States had acquired in the Spanish American War and had actually established a military base there at some point in time. These prisoners were taken there so that they could be held outside of the United States. And part of that is so that until we could figure out who was doing what, we wouldn't necessarily have to take them to trial. And so, had they been in the United States, they would have had to hear the charges against them. If they were at Guantanamo, they didn't. And it seems like every president since Bush has talked about trying to close it. It's very difficult to close Guantanamo. And number five, why were some overseas telephone calls monitored by the National Security Agency? Part of this was to track calls received and made by Al Qaeda and other terrorists to kind of keep them under control. All right, moving on. Oh, I think we are finished. Thank you very much.